So this morning, it is my pleasure to introduce our co-host for today's session. Dr. Maria Bowman is the lead scientist with Soil Health Partnership, where she focuses on overseeing data collection, organization, and analysis for SHP's staff, farmer community, scientific community, collaborators, and partners. And Vincent Gauthier is a research analyst with Environmental Defense Fund. He works with farmers, agricultural organizations, and food companies conducting research on financial mechanisms and policies for boosting climate resilience in U.S. agriculture. Today, Maria and Vincent will be previewing findings from an upcoming report evaluating the impact of conservation practices on the farm bottom line. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome again to everybody who's joining us remotely today. In this webinar, we're going to tell you about some of the findings from a collaboration that's been going on for about the last 8 months or so. And it's a project that's been a partnership between Soil Health Partnership, the Environmental Defense Fund, and Keiko ISOM, an agricultural accounting firm, along with 7 participating farmers. And we will be releasing a report and web landing page for this work next month. So we obviously can't tell you everything about this in this hour, but we're hoping it's going to pique your interest to hear more. The goal of this work was to measure the financial impacts of conservation practices on the farm's bottom line. And we couldn't have done it without the farmers who opened up their books to share their conservation stories and the numbers that go along with them. So today I'm going to start by telling you a little bit more about this project and what we set out to do with this collaboration. I'll tell you a little bit about the farmers that worked with us throughout this process and the numbers they provided. And then we'll give you a preview of some of our key findings around conservation tillage, cover crops, and how the farmers we worked with approached making changes to their management systems. There's been a lot of really good work published and underway trying to understand the impacts of conservation practices on the farm bottom line. And I'm sure you all are familiar with a lot of that work by some of our partners in this space. Some really great work by SARE, PCM, other folks highlighting some of this. And from SHP's perspective, it's really critical to understand both the financial benefits and the financial challenges for farmers that are making changes or adopting soil health management systems. We believe that having a realistic approach to this soil health journey and setting realistic expectations for farmers is really important. We know that building soil health and adopting conservation practices is a long-term investment, and we think that setting that up in that way will contribute to success over the long run. So when we started talking with EDF and Keiko ISOM about working with some farmers to collect information about crop budgets and about their operations, we thought that this was a really unique opportunity to look at how these practices were working for farmers in our network and to tell the stories of how and why farmers are able to make these practices work. And we did this by digging into the numbers with 7 farmers to compare the returns of conservation practices on their own acres, but also across common conservation systems that we saw represented amongst those farmers. And now I'm going to hand it over to Vincent to tell you a little bit more about the methods that we use to compare those farmers' acres on their farms and amongst farmers.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks everyone for attending. This has been really a great collaboration with SHP. We're really grateful to the 7 participating farmers and to the SHP team. So I'm going to go through really quickly some of our methods for this project and how we got the information from farmers to be able to compare across management practices and identify some of the financial outcomes of conservation practices. So first, we set out to recruit a group of farmers for this project with certain criteria in order to make sure that our analysis was comparable and robust. So our recruitment criteria included that the farmers be located in the Midwest states, that they grow corn, soybean, and/or wheat, and that they have at least 3 years of cover crop experience. We also asked that farmers be willing to share their budget data, both management data and financial information, and that they have time to attend the virtual workshops that took place over the summer. And lastly, we asked that those farmers be available and willing to work with the Keiko ISIM team, as well as SHP's field managers in gathering the financial data. So after reaching out to SHP's network and Keiko's client base, 7 farmers were kind enough to participate in this project. And in the virtual environment that we were in over the last few months, we kind of developed a new methodology for gathering this information, given kind of the restrictions from not being able to visit these farmers in person. And so Keiko ISIM developed a Microsoft Excel workbook, and that helped us gather data in a consistent way from our participating farmers. And so that workbook gathered information such as the basic information about the operation, detailed information about the farmers' conservation practices. We also asked about estimated cost changes that farmers associated with the transition to conservation practices. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, we gathered detailed farm level financial information from the 2019 crop year that we used in the comparisons we'll talk about in a little bit. We took a 3-step process to make sure that the data that we were gathering aligned with the farmer experience. So first, as I mentioned before, we held a workshop with the 7 participating farmers in which we walked through how to use the workbook, what information was needed, and answered any of the questions that the farmers had about entering their financial information. And then second, we had one-on-one sessions between the farmer, Keiko's team, and SHP field staff to make sure that we were interpreting their numbers in the workbook correctly and to answer any of the questions the farmers had about what information they had to input. And then lastly, we did some follow-up questionnaires to answer any remaining questions that we had, and also to better understand the conservation approach that farmers were taking and the goals that they set out to accomplish by adopting conservation practices. And then lastly, just to make a note, we also then provided some detailed reports back to these participating farmers to give them some insight from the analysis that was specific for their operation. Next slide. And so once we gathered all that great information from the participating farmers, we divided up those the participating farmers in the different fields and management practices that they were using into some comparison groups so that we could compare the financial outcomes across different management practices. And so, as you can see in the table on the right here, our comparison groups included the following. So fields under conventional practices, so conventional tillage and no cover crops across corn and soybean. A group of conservation tillage, including strip till, reduced till, and no till without cover crops. Then all of the participating farmers and their fields that included conservation tillage and cover crops. And then we further broke down the cover crop groups into recent adopters, so farmers with less than 5 years of experience with using cover crops, and experienced cover croppers, so farmers with more than 5 years of experience, in order to compare over time if farmers were able to make efficiencies with their cover crop systems. So the Keiko team then took all of the financial information across these comparison groups and compared cost and revenue differences, that trends across these different groups that we used in order to develop our key findings and the information that we presented back to our participating farmers. Now I'll hand it over to Maria to talk about some of our farmers, their practices, and some of our key findings.
So Vincent just showed you some of the ways we grouped those farmers to compare practices across acres, but I think it's also worth taking a quick look at the cropping systems and conservation management systems that the farmers in this study were working with. So I think it's worth noting that we worked with farmers from 5 different states. The operation size that they're working range from 640 to 6,000 acres, with the average being about 3,000 acres. And most farmers in this study are working with a corn and soybean rotation, though you'll also see that we had one farmer that had wheat in their rotation, and then that other little icon down there that I pulled from the internet is supposed to be a sugar beet. So we had one farmer with sugar beets in their rotation. And there's a fair bit of variability in tillage practices. So you can see a lot of farmers are working with no-till on some or all acres, but a lot of farmers are also working with some form of strip tillage or reduced tillage, vertical tillage, also pretty common. Same thing with cover crops. So this will be a common theme throughout this presentation, but there's no one size fits all approach to cover crops. And you can see that here in sort of the quick summary of what farmers were getting out there in terms of cover crops and how they're seeding their cover crops. And we have a fair amount of variability in terms of the number of acres cover crops, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well when we get into that cover crop section. So Amanda, if you can go on to the next slide, the key findings that we're going to highlight from this report and some of the lessons that we've learned. Vincent's going to start off by telling us about how conservation tillage reduced operating costs for this group of farmers. And then I'll talk about some of our findings around cover crops and how important experience is when working with cover crops to drive long-term profitability. And then finally, we'll talk about one of the findings of this report that we think is most important, but maybe overlooked in this space. And that's about how farmers are approaching making changes to their conservation systems more broadly and focusing on their goals and their approach to making those changes. So Vincent, back over to you to talk about tillage.
Thanks, Maria. So yeah, our first key finding from these participating farmers was that conservation tillage reduced operating costs. So by reducing the number of tillage passes and the intensity of tillage, farmers were able to save on a few cost items that I'll highlight here. So first, before we talk about some of the detailed cost savings that we saw from conservation tillage, I just want to identify what we mean by per acre costs here, just so that for any of the participants on the line, you can compare these numbers to the right numbers in your budgets. So we looked specifically and compared specifically direct costs. So that includes seeds, input, chemical, fuel, equipment, and labor costs. So it doesn't include overhead costs, crop insurance, electricity, rent. So this is really the direct inputs in the field, the equipment use, labor, etc. So just wanted to start with that. So if you see here on the graph on the left, we can look at some of the comparison groups we had and some of the findings in terms of cost savings. So this graph shows the bar on the left, the red bar on the left is conventional tillage group, fields using conventional tillage. In the middle, the yellow bar is conservation tillage fields without cover crops. And then the green bar on the right is conservation tillage fields with cover crops added. So as you can see, fields using conservation tillage and no cover crops had substantially lower per acre costs than fields using conventional tillage, $404 per acre in direct costs per acre to $448 for the conventional tillage group. Even after adding cover crop costs to fields that were using conservation tillage, that group still had lower per acre costs for corn than the conventional tillage group. And so on these, in this corn comparison across tillage groups, we found that the most substantial savings that farmers were making by using conservation tillage were found through savings in equipment, repair, and fuel costs, and that those were substantially lower compared to the conventional tillage group for corn. There were some increased costs from burn down, for example, which we might expect, but overall, the cost savings from equipment repairs and fuel costs outweighed those increased costs in burn down. Now, if we transition over to soybean, the graph on the left here is the same one as you saw previously, but for soybeans. So again, we found a very similar trend for soybeans where The middle yellow bar showing conservation tillage without cover crops, that per acre costs for that group were much lower than for the conventional tillage group, $217 per acre versus $311 per acre. And again, even for the group that had cover crops, the savings from conservation tillage still gave those fields per acre costs to be similar to the ones using conventional tillage and no cover crops. And again, we found pretty similar trends in terms of where those costs were being saved. And that included equipment savings, fuel cost savings in comparison to conventional tillage. And again, some increased costs from conservation tillage included burn down and machine hire. But again, those cost savings from conservation tillage practices outweighed some of the increased costs associated with those management practices. So overall, we saw that those cost savings from reducing the time spent in the tractor, the intensity of tillage, and the number of passes really did save a lot in terms of costs for the participating farmers in the study. And to give you one in-depth look, I wanted to highlight one of our participating farmers, Brian Ryberg, and his experience with using conservation tillage. So Brian farms 5,300 acres in Minnesota. He uses strip till and no-till with cover crops. His conservation goal was to save costs and improve soil health through reduced disturbance and continuous cover. By using these practices, Brian has found fuel and equipment cost savings. He uses strip till in the fall and plants straight into the strips. And in the years where the cover crops are well established, he goes no-till into his beans. In terms of some detailed cost savings that Brian has found by using conservation tillage and cover crops, Brian was able to reduce his field passes by 25%. And this led to a 60% decrease in fuel consumption, so approximately $52 per acre. He also was able to decrease his time on the tractor, from using 2 four-wheel drive tractors at approximately 400 hours per year to then shifting to conservation tillage and only using one of those tractors at 200 hours per year. So that came out, if you use some estimated costs, that's about $100,000 per year in savings. And on a per acre basis, that's about $25 to $37 of savings from transitioning to conservation tillage. And Brian was also able to kind of reduce the risk of transitioning to these practices by receiving cost share from USDA programs, including EQIP at $18 per acre and CSP at $40,000 over 1,500 acres. That helped Brian make the transition and make his system even more profitable by transitioning to conservation tillage. I'm going to hand it back over to Maria to talk about some of our cover crop findings.
Thanks, Vincent. So in some of those slides that Vincent just showed you, you probably noticed that if we look across all of the farmers in this study with cover crops have higher per acre costs than no-till systems or reduced till alone. But it's important that we acknowledge that farmers are making an investment when they start working with cover crops. And I think that's something we really wanted to highlight here. There are a number of upfront costs that can't be ignored, as well as learning costs that are associated with working with cover crops. What cover crop species to work with or what mix works for your farm, how to plant that cover crop, when to terminate it, and how to deal with those inevitable unexpected weather conditions and fitting your cover crop to the challenges of your crop rotation system. So in those first few years, it's really important to figure out, what are realistic expectations about how long it might take to see some returns from working with that cover crop and what some of those risks and short-term costs might be. Those benefits can take a while to show up. And when we thought a little bit about how to dig in deeper on the cover crop numbers, we remembered that a lot of the farmers that we were working with had different amounts of experience working with cover crops. So we decided to take a look at what the cost and returns looked like for the 4 farmers that had up to 5 years of experience working with cover crops. So that's that early or recent adopter category that's represented by that red bar. And then in a more experienced adopter category with cover crops or more than 5 years of experience, you can see that yellow bar. So breaking down that green bar into the red bar and the yellow bar, we can see that actually the net returns to farmers with cover crop acres differ substantially according to the amount of experience. So especially for soybeans here, you can see that the experienced cover crop adopters had some of the highest net returns in our study. And this was driven primarily by lower input costs. So that could be due to improvements in nutrient cycling or efficiency or soil health benefits, or just experience working with that practice as they dial in some reductions in input costs over time. Next slide. So if we look at all of our farmers and the types of cover crop practices they're using, just to make this a little bit more tangible, I wanted to show you a comparison of some of the high-level characteristics of the cover crop systems of these farmers. And again, I think it's really important, and you can see this, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to cover crops in these farmers, and we see that more broadly across the Soil Health Partnership. Farmers are using really diverse cover crops and practices to get the job done out there. But aside from that, another thing that really strikes me about this table is that farmers are working with different species and seeding methods. They're working with different numbers of acres to try and trial that practice out there to get it to work. And you can see that actually some of the farmers with more experience are figuring out how to make this work on more acres. It's true that of those farmers, they've got cover crops on at least half of their operation. And it also looks like they've been able to get those seed costs down. So in general, you can see that there might be a trend toward lower seed costs for those farmers that have some more experience. So this breaks down actually some of those cost categories for recent and experienced cover crop adopters that we worked with in this study. And we can see that there are a few areas where average corn input costs were lower for those farmers that were more experienced with cover crops. So cover crop seed is one example. You can see that those experienced cover croppers are on average spending less on seed. They're also spending less on total fertilizer. So we don't necessarily know why this is based upon the work that we did, but it could be due to improved nutrient cycling or improved nitrogen use efficiency, because oftentimes they're making changes to their nutrient management at the same time as they're working to implement these soil health management systems. In fact, one of the farmers that we worked with in Iowa had this as a goal to actually improve nutrient use efficiency, dial back on those fertilizer costs, and we saw that show up here in those fertilizer costs. Repairs and equipment are also another area where those experienced cover croppers are spending less money. That could be because they've figured out the right seeding method that works for them over time, or that they're saving wear and tear on their equipment due to changes in soil structure. We've heard that from farmers, that it's just a lot easier to plant once you get your soil health up and you've been working with the system for a while. So that could be one factor. But I think one thing that definitely shows up is that dialing in that system over time is helping to get those costs down. So I'm going to actually talk a little bit about one example that we think epitomizes that on the next slide. And you will be able to read more about this in our report, but one really great example of finding these efficiencies over time that we will highlight is Gasser Farms in Iowa. So Chris and his family drill almost 5,000 acres of cereal rye every year, and they've worked hard to keep their costs down in their management system. That was one of their main goals, in addition to reducing erosion. And like many farmers we work with at SHP, Chris has trialed some different cover crop species over time. So he finally settled on cereal rye because he found annual ryegrass was pretty difficult to terminate, was not super cold hardy, whereas cereal rye was relatively less costly, pretty easy to terminate, and cost effective to get out there. In addition, he reduced the cost of getting that cover crop out there by moving away from aerial seeding, which they found was costly and pretty inconsistent in terms of getting the cover crop established. And they've actually gone toward drilling those acres and doing it themselves. So another interesting transition that worked for their farm, but might not work for everyone. And finally, this was another really interesting example of ways to reduce costs. They're spending a lot less money on cereal rye than a lot of the other farmers we work with at SHP. $7 an acre on cereal rye because they're growing their own cover crop seed. So they're putting that cereal rye out there on about 100 to 150 acres for seed, and then they sell what they don't use, right? So getting those seed costs down from about $13 an acre, which is what we typically see for cereal rye at SHP, to $7 an acre can really add up over large numbers of acres. As we were analyzing the numbers and putting the report together, a final key finding that we wanted to highlight that might sound obvious to some of you, especially those of you that are farmers, but I think is really important for some of the rest of this audience, is that successful adoption of conservation practices has a lot to do with the process and the approach that farmers are taking. So when we tried to summarize what we saw as leading to success, we bucketed these into 3 factors that we saw. So the first one was having clear goals to achieve through conservation practices. The second is taking a stepwise approach to trialing and adopting cover crops. And this was often in contrast to what we saw with conservation tillage or no-till, where farmers might make the shift a little quicker or on more acres. And finally, targeting conservation approaches based on specific field characteristics, crop rotations, or constraints that are unique to the operation, right? Like every operation is different. You have a different number of employees, you have different equipment available to use, and that conservation approach is going to look different depending on what acres you're trying to work with and what the challenges are. So much like in that Gasser Farms example that we just talked about, having those clear goals in mind, whether it's improving soil structure, reducing erosion and keeping soil in place, or becoming more profitable through reducing input costs, was really important to seeing the change through to the successful outcome. And the farmers that participated in this study, we heard 2 goals commonly. One was, again, to improve the soil structure to help with erosion control and water holding capacity. I think this is really a catch-all for one tangible area where soil health improvements are seen by farmers. So we hear from a lot of farmers in our network that those improvements in soil structure can help with everything from ponding in the field. They can help with being able to get out there during a challenging growing season a little earlier or have a larger window for planting. They also help with that erosion control and keeping the soil in place. So I think this is just an expression of how that soil health plays out on the farm. And then the second category that we heard from a lot of farmers, and Vincent already showed you all how this was working out, they wanted to reduce hours on the tractor to save time, machinery, and overhead costs, right? Why spend the time in the tractor if you can save money and make it easier on yourself? So these were 2 things that we heard across all of our farmers. So when we think about how this transition process differs between conservation and cover crops, if you're a farmer that's going out wanting to make a change, I think in general, there's a lot of research that supports the expectation that you're going to see short-term savings if you make a switch to reducing tillage or going to no-till. So I think that's part of the reason that what we saw with the farmers we were working with was more of a willingness to try that on more acres or just make that change a little more quickly. Whereas for cover crops, I think it's really important that we see farmers taking their time to get it right with cover crops. So they often started out with just a few acres. That's one thing that we really stress at SHP is taking that trial field, which might be only 40 or 60 acres, starting out with a few acres and trialing different species and seeding methods, and then paying attention to the challenges and the benefits that you run into, right? If you start small, you have a little bit less on the table, it's a little lower risk, and you can work some of the kinks out of the system before you start dialing it in over more acres. And this is really important because we know that not only can it take a while to develop a management system that works, but it can also take a while for those benefits to show up. So some of them, like weed control, might show up a little sooner, but in particular, some of those soil health benefits might take 3 or 5 or 10 years to show up. So that risk mitigation component is really important. And I think it's one of the reasons that farmers rely a lot on some transitional financial assistance from government programs and our CS programs to help them through that transition period. Next slide. So the final point that we wanted to make around this transition and the approach that farmers take is that we saw farmers targeting specific combinations of practices to specific acres depending on the goals that they had and the challenges and constraints they were facing. So again, this might sound obvious, but I think it's really important to remember that you can't just tell a farmer to go out there and use a specific cover crop and use no-till, and there are going to be a lot of benefits that follow, because every acre is different, every operation is different. A farmer might choose to no-till some acres and strip-till others based upon the soil type. They might choose to alternate no-till and no-till their beans and do some strip tillage with their corn. They might choose to fly seed on some acres if they're time constrained and drill others. It's just always an adventure getting out there every year, especially to try and get cover crops out there and get them terminated. And so having a flexible approach to how this happens on the landscape is really important if you're a farmer. Another example I would say of some how constraints and targets interact with this is, we see a lot of farmers working with Planting Green in the SHP network. And I think that can be a really valuable tool in a farmer's toolkit, especially in a particular growing season, if you're time limited with getting out there and planting. But it's also not something that every farmer should strive for, because it works with some cover crops really well and not others. And so again, no one size fits all to this. And at SHP more broadly, one tool that we've been providing to farmers and to all of you all to highlight this management specific approach to soil health management is these business cases that we've been putting out. So in the last year, we put out 2 new business cases at SHP. The first one there on the left features Mike Bias, who's in Indiana, and he had an erosion control goal but found a weed control benefit. And then more recently, we worked with Roger and Wes Stylestra in Iowa to talk about how they've incorporated cover crops into their nutrient management strategy and to really follow their management timeline. So again, you can see there, even in the snapshot on that business case, that they made changes between 2014 and 2020 from sort of working with cover crops to really working with advanced soil health practices and nutrient management on their farm, and following that journey throughout the business case. With that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Vincent for some final thoughts, and then after that, we'll take some questions from you all with the remaining time.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I just wanted to share some final thoughts, and these are based both from this project and our experience from these findings, as well as work that EDF, SHP, and some of our partners have been doing overall in understanding how to create profitable conservation systems in US Ag. So the first point, and this is really connected to the work that we did in this project, is that we found that the value of understanding the financial outcomes and really measuring those financial outcomes of conservation practices really help farmers understand how their conservation systems are working and how they compare to other fields in their operation. And it also can help farmers that have yet to undertake these practices better understand the risks or the what they can expect as outcomes as they undertake the transition. So, we really think that there's a need for more financial information about conservation practices, and that information be on par with information that's gathered and disseminated about conventional practices, and that information can help farmers be more profitable in their decision-making for adopting conservation practices. It can also help their financial partners, such as their lenders, their advisors, to support them in that transition and reduce the uncertainty that we hear about in terms of what those outcomes might be financially for undertaking practices like conservation tillage and cover crops. And kind of to that point, to help reduce some of that uncertainty and sometimes bridge the time gaps that we saw, for example, with cover crops, that there's kind of a transition to going from the first year of adoption to one that is more profitable and cost efficient. We need to develop forms of financial assistance, whether that be transition loans, cost share programs, or other innovative financing ideas to get to kind of reduce the burden, reduce the risk, and improve the profitability of these conservation practices over time. So there's a need for some innovation and some new ways of financing that is specific to what we know and what we're learning more about in terms of what the transition really looks like and what are some of the barriers holding farmers back from adopting these soil health practices. And lastly, this is kind of more of how we think about conservation as an approach. We're starting to understand that this collective network approach to conservation and understanding and gathering data about conservation, such as what SHP is doing, allows for collective learning and kind of efficiencies of learning by kind of pooling many farmers' experience with these practices, and that by taking this collective network approach, we can reduce the risk and uncertainty about adopting conservation that farmers may face. So we really believe that we need more of this type of approach, and that the data kind of follow that network approach and be disseminated across networks so that farmers can see what others are experiencing and can inform their decisions based on others' experience.